Wondering which 10 Saviors of Uldum cards are going to make the biggest impact on the meta? Well, I've got some guesses.
Hey buddy, watch this.
That's right, this video is about my top 10 cards for Saviors of Uldum, and since it's almost here, it's time to lock in some predictions for the most impactful, the most powerful cards in the entire set. Now remember, these are guesses. Do not craft cards based on this list. Wait a little bit to see how these perform in a real meta environment. This is more for fun than educational purposes, so let's go ahead and see just how wrong I'm gonna be. Starting off at the number 10 spot here, I have Oasis Surger for Druid. And this is a pretty crazy card. If you can complete the Druid quest, get both of these choose ones active, you get two 5/5 minions with Rush, which is just absurd. I've seen it time and time again, how well that can line up across various boards, or just be two giant 5/5s. Even if you don't use the Rush aspects, that's just a big old board for 5 mana. Beyond that, this card actually feels pretty good even to play as multiple 3/3s with Rush. If you think about things like the old Hunter Spellstone, sometimes you'd have to play it for only 2 3/3s. You weren't super upset about it. You still got 6/6 in stats. This is like that, but they have Rush, so you can even use them to remove something, take some value trades against small to medium-sized boards, or again, just dump some stats on the board. So at a base level, I think Oasis Surger is a solid card, and then with the quest completion, this thing is absolutely absurd. And I think that means it might get played in either scenario, and although it may not get there immediately with Druid, as soon as the quest can line up at some deck in the future, this card's going to be an absolute lock for it, and one of the most influential cards in that style of deck. So moving on to the number 9 spot here, I have the Weaponized Wasp for Shaman. 3 mana, 3/3 if you control Lackey, deal 3 damage. Well, that's a pretty powerful early game swing, being able to remove something of your opponent's while still protecting your minion for only 3 mana. And it's got Battlecry synergies, which are looking really good for Shaman moving into this expansion with their Battlecry synergy quest. With Lackeys as well, that fits right into that package, and we know Lackeys are great cards, and Shaman has some fantastic ways to generate them. What all that means is you've got a card here that synergizes super well, has an incredibly big payoff, will be fairly consistent despite its conditionality, and that means this is going to be a nightmare when played in a fairly aggressive or tempo style Shaman deck. It's going to be a relevant part of the meta. So now let's take a look at the Neferset Thrasher for Warlock. I think this card's flying under some people's radars, but I really, really like it. 3 mana, 4/5 is a great stat line for an aggressive Warlock deck. Now, it does have a downside. Whenever it attacks, you take damage, but here's the deal. If you're getting to a scenario where this minion is attacking, you're probably pretty happy and probably okay to sacrifice 3 damage, because you really want to play this thing on curve in the early game when health is not that big of a concern. And having a big old stat line like this for Zoo is fantastic. If you think about the old card like Darkshire Councilman, you were really pumped when you could get that thing up to 4/5. It started as a 1/5, 4/5 was great. And this just starts there. Of course, it doesn't go any higher, but you're just getting it guaranteed. Beyond that, there are actually some synergies here where dealing damage to your hero can be a good thing. I think we might actually see a deck with some self-damage aspects. There's some great new support cards and some old ones as well. So this could be advantageous instead of a downside, which makes this even better. So I think in either regard, this card's going to get some play, and the potential for it to be really, really good is quite high. So I like this one a lot. So now let's take a look at the Psychopump from Priest, and this 4 mana 3/1 summons you a random friendly minion that died this game, and then you also give that minion Reborn. And I've had this played against me a few times already in the Theory Crafting live stream, and every time I was like, wow, that is an insane play on turn 4. There's so many things happening. There's a lot of stats in play, and the Reborn aspect makes it all fairly sticky too. So Psychopump is one of the best like turn 4 tempo plays I think I've seen in a really long time, comparing super favorably to even fantastic cards like Piloted Shredder. And I think although Priest has struggled in the past to achieve a more early game board oriented style of deck, with cards like this one and some maybe Death Rattle synergies, the sky's the limit for what that deck can achieve. Priest might finally get there on the back of Psychopump. I think this is good enough to like drive that style of archetype because there's just so much that this card does on turn 4. And then there's also like weird combo shenanigan potentials and even some big style decks that could perhaps utilize Psychopump. I don't think that's quite the path for this card. I think it is more the early game focus. But because it has that kind of backup plan, there's almost certainly some way somewhere down the line where this card is going to work. And that's why it's ranking on this list. So now let's take a look at the Hyena Alpha in the number 6 spot. 4-mana 3/3 beast for Hunter that summons you 2/2 hyenas if you have a secret, giving you a total of 7/7 in stats for 4 mana, but split across multiple bodies, which is generally a good thing for Hunter because you like being able to trade in beasts or having some beasts survive, so not putting all your eggs in one basket is advantageous. And this is just a big old pile of stats on turn 4. Now, there is a conditional aspect that you have to have a secret, but we've seen Secret Hunter be a successful style of deck already. This card would slot in rather nicely, and Hunter does have some secrets that are pretty easy to keep alive or keep active. Things like Rat Trap, for instance. Your opponent typically doesn't want to remove your Rat Traps. If they do, you get a 6/6, so you're happy. If they don't, you get maybe a 7/7 total stat line with the Hyena Alpha. In both cases, that's a great result. So you're putting some pressure, some awkwardness, and creating a really powerful turn 4 tempo play with Hyena Alpha, which Hunter loves. They like stats on board, they like beasts, they like pressure, they like damage. So this card basically lines up perfectly for an archetype that's already proven, which means it looks very, very promising. So now moving into our top 5, I have Tiamat, the 7-mana 6/6 neutral legendary. A lot of people are calling this the next Ziliax. I clearly don't think it's the next Ziliax, or it'd be number 1 on my list. I think it's really good, and I think a lot of decks are going to run it, but I don't think like all decks are going to run it. Of course, not all decks run Ziliax, but you get the idea. I don't think it's going to be quite as widespread because its mana cost does hold it back a little bit for some decks. Hyper aggro decks aren't going to want to use this. There are some board-based tempo decks that'll have better options than this to run. So I think it's going to be a little bit more awkward to squeeze into a list than most people realize. Like right now, in all these pre-release things, we're tossing it in because we don't really know what decks look like. But as you really start to refine a game plan, more and more often, I think a card like this will get cut for those very specific niche things that decks are trying to achieve. It'll still be played. It's on my list. I got it in the top 5. I think it's going to be great. Just maybe not quite the ceiling that a lot of people are envisioning for this card because the mana cost is awkward. It doesn't do some things that decks want to do. It's more about this like trade on board where it feels really good. In reality, I've almost never seen people play it with Taunt and very rarely with Wind Fury, so it's kind of narrow and it's almost exactly that minion-based Firelands portal that we thought it would be. There's occasional upsides beyond that, but they're pretty minor. And frankly, not all decks would run Firelands Portal, and this can't go face like Firelands Portal could either. So although, again, a good card, you probably think I'm like trashing Tiamat here. I'm not. I think he's awesome. Just not quite as powerful as some people are expecting, so only making it into the top 5, which is still an incredibly high honor. So now let's take a look at the Frightened Flunky for Warrior at the number 4 spot. And this one's really just all about Stonehill Defender, which was one of the most played cards ever in Hearthstone. Like, just tossed it into anything. I think Frightened Flunky has that exact same lifespan and prominence that Stonehill did because it's the exact same effect. The body's a little different and the cost is a little different, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. So yeah, I think it's almost a given that this card's going to be played in pretty much any warrior deck, really, just because it's an early thing that can turn into a late game thing, which is nice. It's something you can top deck in the late game as a low cost card and still feel good about, which is nice for control decks to have some early game flexibility that can shift into some late game value. Plus, with Warrior right now, there are only a limited number of taunts, and Discover effects are biased towards your class cards, which means you're going to get one of a few good taunts, including often cycling into Frightened Flunkies. I've already done it once where I cycled into 4 straight Frightened Flunkies, building myself a nice little board while still ending up with the same results. Being able to fill your mana curve like that can be pretty nice while building some speed bumps for your opponent. So all in all, this just makes a lot of sense. It's a proven formula for a card, and it's a safe bet. Maybe it won't be quite as dominant as some other cards on this list, but I think it will be one of the most pervasive cards on this list within its class. So now let's take a look at the Evil Recruiter for Warlock at our number 3 spot. This one is a 3/3 that summons you a 5/5 demon when you destroy a lackey. And after playing this card a handful of times, it always just feels ridiculously strong to get this many stats out there for that cost. You don't mind killing lackeys because their value is mostly bundled into their battle cry. And we've seen that lackeys work really well in Zoo. And I think they're going to work even better moving forward. And I am envisioning Zoo being a pretty high tier deck immediately. So a card like Evil Recruiter just looks perfect for that environment. It's one of the strongest turns I've seen so far from Saviors of Uldum cards. So although this one is exposed to a little bit more risk than some of the cards on this list, because if it's not lining up exactly in its deck, or if lackeys just don't make sense in the future, this card could fall off pretty hard. But I think it's just so good that it will drive the deck instead and become a star of the deck and feel so bad to play against and so powerful that it's going to be one of the most noteworthy cards of the expansion, and that's why it's in my top 3. So now at the number 2 spot, we have Corrupt the Waters, the Shaman quest. I rank this as my best quest in the expansion, and I think it's also just going to be one of the best cards for 2 reasons. I think it's really easy to activate in Shaman, and I think the payoff is enormous. Being able to double your battle cries in a turn can just do some absurd things. If you run a lot of low-cost minions, you can get like 3, 4, 5 battle cries doubled in a single turn, which is absurd value, often absurd tempo. If you run mid to late game stuff, you can get really powerful battle cries doubled, which can be pretty insane as well. So this seems to have a lot of flexibility, a lot of output, and not a lot of delay or challenge in activating it. And those 3 things add up into a card that looks like it's going to have a really influential impact on the game. I think probably it's going to be like a burn deck where you play like Life Drinkers and maybe some Weaponized Wasps like we saw earlier and just hit your opponent really, really hard. But anything could happen with this card because I think it works across a variety of different styles of play and archetypes. So Corrupt the Waters just makes a lot of sense to me and seems like one of the standout cards that we've seen throughout the pre-release period. I think that's going to continue into the live Saviors of Uldum world as well. And now finally at our number 1 spot, I have Zephyrus the Great. Of course, a neutral legendary minion, and if your deck has no duplicates, he'll offer you the perfect card, which if you still don't know what that means, essentially he gives you 3 discover options that are determined by Hearthstone algorithms and AI to be the best things in your given situation. So depending on how much mana you have, your opponent's health, the board state, all kinds of different variables, Zephyrus will offer you something that seems to fit the game state really well, often like setting up lethals, for instance, or giving you some absurd value card, or clearing your opponent's board. And after seeing this played a lot, it's actually really rather good. It turns out he does give you some pretty fantastic cards time and time again. And there's also a lot of nuance and strategy that goes into kind of guiding his decision making a little bit, which is really rewarding to see. So a lot about the design of this card is fantastic, but also just the power level I think is going to be off the charts because the cards offered are great and you can just get things in your deck that wouldn't otherwise be possible and find solutions and miracles that wouldn't otherwise happen. Now clearly there's a big additionality here. Not every deck is going to be able to run Zephyrus because of this no duplicate challenge, but I'm guessing that at least 1 or 2 no duplicate decks will happen either now or in a future expansion where we maybe rotate out bombs, for instance, or we just get more cards in the card pool. Perhaps there's even more no duplicate support in a future set. We don't know. But regardless, I think some deck's going to stick at some point, and that's going to be because of Zephyrus the Great. And if he's helping you define a tier 1 deck, and he's the most powerful card in a tier 1 deck, then sure enough, he's going to be one of the best cards in the expansion, and I'm venturing perhaps even the best because I think there's a pretty high limit on what this card can do. So he can do a ton, basically. That means to me he's not only the best design card of the set, but perhaps going to be the most powerful as well, taking my number 1 spot. And there you go, guys. That's my top 10 list for Saviors of Uldum. I think, a lot of stuff you probably expected to see on this list, maybe a handful of things you didn't, nothing too revolutionary. Maybe the order could surprise some people, but I want to hear your thoughts. What do you think? Did I get it all wrong? Did I get it right? What cards are we going to see? Which ones did I miss? Which ones didn't belong on this list? Share all those thoughts in the comments below. Bookmark this video so you can come back in a year and make fun of me. I'll join in. I'm looking forward to it. I like learning from our mistakes in these sorts of things. But until then, everybody, thank you so very much for watching, and until next time, game on.